A series as long as Final Fantasy often has many features that define it in the minds of fans. So far, we have seen great stories, exceptionally deep gameplay, worlds that grow and change, and high degrees of customization. But we haven't really seen all of these at the same time. Often, one has been traded off for another. So, we have yet to see a game that actually includes everything that makes Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy. We've yet to see a culmination of the series. Until now. Rounding out the 16-bit era, we get a game that attempts to encapsulate all of those features that have made Final Fantasy so memorable. Is it successful? Let's find out as I examine Final Fantasy VI from the top. Initially releasing for the Super Famicom in April of 1994, Final Fantasy VI came to Japan first. Thankfully, the North American translation was developed and would be released a little over 6 months later, as Final Fantasy III. If you've been following the series, you already know why. With Final Fantasies II, III and V being Japan exclusive during the early years, the North American releases of 4 and then 6 were renamed to maintain continuity in numbering. Thankfully, this is the last game before numbering was unified. This specific version of Final Fantasy VI, or 3, also features on the SNES Classic Mini, making it officially available in Europe for the first time. Like the prior 16-bit titles, 6 would also appear on the PlayStation. In North America, it was joined by Final Fantasy V in Final Fantasy Anthology. Europe received this version as a standalone title, mostly. It did include a demo for the then upcoming Final Fantasy X. This version is mostly unchanged. Even the script has negligible changes, though a few bugs were fixed. Once more, the Game Boy Advance was provided with a port, this time Final Fantasy VI Advance. Alongside the usual adjustments to graphics and sound, the game was retranslated, though like earlier games, some lines with cult status were retained. Bonus content is also present in the form of 2 dungeons and 4 espers. This version also fixed a few bugs, though apparently introduced some others. Finally, the smartphone versions were released in 2014. With the same edition coming to PCs through Steam in 2015. This release has some of the controversy of 5 in the form of redesigned character sprites. The battle interfaces also received large modifications, and I'll talk about both of these more later. Before I move into the main part of the video, I'm going to drop a big spoiler warning right here. With so many of the aspects of the game being interwoven, it'll be almost impossible to really talk about many features without some minor spoilers. I will try my best to avoid spoilers, but there certainly will be some. So if you wish to avoid all spoilers, skip to the time shown for the conclusions. As always, let's look at gameplay first. At the basic level, there isn't a huge amount of difference from the last 2 games. On the surface of the battle system, the only major change is spell delay, which falls somewhere between 4 and 5, with a small amount of delay before spells actually activate. We have a party of 4 in battle, but that party of 4 can be made out of 14 possible party members, which you are free to assemble however you like once you are a certain distance into the game. The biggest change from 5 is the removal of the job system. However, this doesn't mean the gameplay of Final Fantasy VI is any less complex. Firstly, each character has their own special ability and base stats that can lean them towards some of the old jobs. Terra has reasonable strength and high magic, allowing her to be built into whichever role you would prefer. Her ability is Morph or Trance in some versions, in which she transforms and gets increased strength and magic, making her quite the powerhouse. To compensate, this ability lasts for a limited amount of time and must be recharged before it can be used again, which may take a number of battles. Locke is a thief. His stats lean that way, and his ability is Steal. He is also capable of using Mug when equipped with an item, using a system we'll discuss shortly. Edgar's stats make him more inclined for physical combat. He has the ability to use tools, special items that must be bought or found. They don't need to be equipped, simply selected from the menu when you select Tool in battle. Many of these tools have powerful effects and no drawbacks, to the point where for much of the game, Edgar will be using tools rather than regular attacks. Sabin draws from the Monk class with his weapon choice and high strength. His Blitz ability is a new mechanic. After you select Blitz, you must then input a button combination that corresponds to the Blitz attack you wish to use. Many of these are very strong, but if you get the combination wrong, the attack will do nothing. Celes is similar to Terra in stats and role. Her ability, Runic, allows her to absorb almost any magic spell, replenishing her MP when she does. While incredibly useful at times, it is basically pointless against any enemies that are not magic based. Shadow is visually inspired by a ninja, with the stats to match and the ability to throw weapons and items, much like ninjas from previous games. He has an additional quality in that his faithful hound Interceptor may occasionally intercept an attack and automatically reply with a strong counter. Cyan is a dedicated physical fighter. In fact, he is one of the few characters that it is essentially impractical to try and turn into a mage. His special ability is Bushido, which can unleash various special sword attacks. Its drawback is a way to try your patience in some versions. You must sit and wait for a gauge to fill until it reaches the number of the technique you want to use. Later versions made it less annoying by letting you select the attack and then it will charge. Gao is another strong character, though he has decent magic as well. He is an interesting character in that his main ability actually replaces the attack command. Rages are a cross between blue magic and a berserker. They must be learned from enemies in the Veld, a special region in the game. Once a rage is triggered, the player will have no control over Gao for the rest of the battle. Many of these rages are very strong, but the lack of control is a downside. Using him as a spellcaster does allow you to retain control, and many rages have a magic component, so raising his magic might be wise. Setzer is a gambler, with his weapons being themed after gambling and pub games. His stats lean more physical, yet his ability is a literal slot machine that will use a special magic attack determined by the reels. Strago is a classical blue mage, learning enemy abilities, called laws in this game, that have been used against the party while he is a member. His stats are obviously geared for magic. Realm is another curious case, acting very like the Beastmaster. Her sketch ability will paint an enemy and utilise an attack or ability from that enemy's profile. Sketch can, like Locke's Steal, be upgraded to actually take control of an enemy. The enemy will use Realm's turn and will not attack the party while controlled. However, if struck by a physical attack, the control will end. Mog is a Moogle, with stats angled more towards magic. He has the ability to dance. This is another Berserker style ability that also has hints of the Geomancer and, obviously, Dancer jobs. Dances are learned by fighting on different terrains, and are more likely to successfully trigger when used on that terrain. Once a dance is underway, Mog will randomly use one of 4 attacks each turn, the selection of attacks differing depending upon the dance. The last 2 characters are hidden and only available in the second half of the game. They have unique capabilities, but cannot equip espers, which will become relevant later. Go-Go is a mimic, and like the mimic from Final Fantasy V, can be equipped with 3 abilities. This includes other characters' special abilities. Equipping Go-Go with magic will allow the use of all spells known by the current party too. Umaro is a classical berserker. Uncontrollable, high strength, low utility. It can be equipped with some items that add different types of attacks that may be used, and can be interesting to experiment with. So there are plenty of different abilities, but they are not the only way that job style complexity is apparent in Final Fantasy VI. Supporting the abilities of the characters is the relic system. It isn't totally new. We've seen accessories as an equipment option before. In Final Fantasy V, they were generally just static buffs. Here, there are plenty that will provide effects in that style. Others, though, may grant additional abilities. For example, the Dragoon Boots can change the attack command to jump, allowing you to recreate the Dragoon job, while the Master Scroll produces an effect similar to Final Fantasy V's Rapid Fire. What gives this system the depth to make it comparable to the job system is the fact that you may equip 2 relics per character. This allows you to create combos such as the above Master Scroll alongside the dual-wield Grant and Genji glove, giving you the same 8 attacks a turn combo that was possible in 5. Magical characters can get in on the act too, with relics that allow dual casting and reducing MP cost of all spells to 1, giving ridiculous damage output for next to no cost. Equipment in general is more important in this game than it has been in the past, as on top of various elemental affinities, many pieces of equipment will also confer stat boosts to the character holding them. A character's stats work like they do in 5, in that there are only 4 main stats, and those stats are unaffected by level. The combat stats will typically be calculated from the base stats and equipment. HP and MP are the only stats to be linked to level, but even they can be affected by the stat growth system. In a fashion, this stat growth system is very reminiscent of the very first game in the series, with stat boosts occurring as part of the action of levelling up. But it isn't partially random like the first game's stat boosts. In fact, the player is very much involved, and if they are unaware, could potentially raise absolutely no stats through the course of the game. The method of improving stats relies on espers. Espers are the summons of this game, and they work very differently. In battle, once summoned they will play an animation and deal damage or provide an effect, which doesn't sound too different so far, but this is effectively the only similarity to previous summons. Instead of a specific summoner character or job, all characters are capable of summoning. However, each character can only be equipped with 1 summon at a time, which can only be used once per battle, which could be interpreted as making them less effective than previous summons. But in truth, summoning espers in battle may well be their least important use. The passive effects of equipping espers are far and away more useful. To fully explain, let's first have a look at the levelling system. Like Final Fantasy V, finishing a battle grants you 2 types of points: EXP and also Magic AP. We all know EXP, it's been in all but one game in this series so far. EXP accumulates, granting the character a level up at certain milestones. While the numerical level of the character has no effect on the main stats, it does have a large impact on combat calculations, so higher level characters will be stronger if all other variables are the same. They don't have to be the same though. You can increase stats, which is where espers come in. When looking at an esper, you will see quite a lot of information. For now, we'll concentrate on this part here that indicates a stat boost. These boosts can increase the 4 main stats or grant a boost to HP or MP. But these are not temporary passive boosts like those that equipment grants. These boosts are permanent and are applied every time you level up when that esper is equipped to that character. So leveling twice with Ifrit equipped will leave the character with 2 additional points of strength. Depending on how much early game grinding you do, you will likely be able to gain stats between 60 and 80 times if you raise the characters all the way up to level 99. This freeform system allows you to raise the stats of your characters in any way you please, if carefully managed. With each esper only capable of being equipped to one character at a time, and some espers not unlocked until late in the game, you may need to shuffle and switch espers between battles to grow specific stats across multiple characters in the most efficient way. Because these stat boosts are applied when you level up, the esper with the stat boost you want needs only be equipped for the battle in which you gain the last experience to cross the threshold and earn another level. Stat boosts aren't the only factor to consider with espers. Like experience and levels, the other battle reward, Magic AP, works in conjunction with espers. If anything, it is even more closely linked. Looking back at the esper profiles, you'll see that each esper has a range of magic spells associated with it, and each of those spells has a multiplier. When you earn Magic AP, it is applied to each spell in accordance to that multiplier. Once a spell accumulates 100 points, that spell is learned by the character that the esper is equipped to. So if a spell has a multiplier of 5, earning 20 AP will learn that spell, while a spell with just a 1 times multiplier will require the full 100 points. Spells may appear on more than one esper with different multipliers, giving you even more to consider if you are aiming for maximum efficiency. The flexibility of the esper system allows all of the characters, except Umaru and Gogo, to learn and use magic. Obviously, some characters have base stats that are better suited to magic, but with the fine control over stat growth granted by the espers, you can viably turn most characters into competent spellcasters if you are willing to micromanage their leveling. The last thing to talk about when it comes to gameplay is the first instance of fully designed sub-games in the series. Minigames have appeared before, but only as a hidden bonus, never as an integrated feature. That changes with the introduction of the Dragon's Neck Colosseum. Only available in the second half of the game, the Colosseum has a big twist on combat. To enter, you must wager an item, which will determine what prize you will get for winning, and which enemy you must face. To complicate matters, you can only choose a single character to face this enemy, and you will not be in control during the battle. The character will basically act randomly, using any of their abilities or even any magic they may have learned. The key to success in the Colosseum is refining the character's equipment loadout. If you know what you are going to face, clearly because you have a fantastic memory and not at all because you looked at a wiki page, you can tailor your armour and relics to neutralise any particular attacks that might cause problems, such as attacks that cause instant death, or particular elements the enemy favours. The rewards from the Colosseum include some of the most powerful weapons and relics in the game. In turn, the risk is also high. If you lose the fight, you lose the item you wagered. While there are few items that cannot be found elsewhere, the best items are often rare steals or drops from very powerful enemies, and may take a great deal of time to find. Ironically, stealing is one great use of the Colosseum. Equipping Go-Go with 3 steel commands and using a relic to make them Mug, alongside other equipment to reduce the risk of defeat, you can throw Go-Go into a battle at the Colosseum and let the randomizer choose to steal most of the time. While you can only steal a single item per battle, you are able to ensure that every battle is a particular enemy, effectively reducing the amount of time needed, as you aren't dealing with other encounters while trying to find a specific enemy in a dungeon. Overall, the gameplay of Final Fantasy VI is fantastic. The ATB system is still engaging, and the amount of customization available allows the player to construct a party according to their needs and preference. There is also a remarkable amount of depth. By combining stat growth, equipment and magic spells, you can recreate all sorts of character classes reminiscent of previous games. If the game has one flaw, it is the difficulty. It is more than possible to get through the game without in-depth stat management or fine-tuned equipment setups, which does mean that if you take advantage of all the systems, you will have a very easy ride. Which isn't always a bad thing. Not every game has to be Dark Souls. And lower difficulty does allow you to explore the world more freely. Just looking at a still image, the world design of Final Fantasy VI is fine. Very much the same as previous games, with a variety of environments using various geographical features to keep the player reasonably contained until they progress the story. For the first time, some environments actually change gameplay in subtle ways, and that is beyond the art and enemy encounters available. The Veldt, for example, is a wide open plain that has a few features that separate it from other places in the game. For starters, every enemy formation, other than most bosses, that you have previously encountered, can be found while running around the Veldt. In a way, it acts like a living, semi-random bestiary. It was clearly included to benefit 2 characters specifically. Gau can only use his secondary ability, Leap, while on the Veldt. It instantly ends the battle and removes Gau from the party. After a random amount of battles, Gau will return to the party, now capable of using the rages of every enemy that was present in the battle he left and the one he returned to. The other character to benefit is the Blue Mage Strago, whose laws are learned from enemies. With the Veldt containing almost every enemy you have already seen, you can hunt down the laws that you need. The Veldt also has a secondary effect, in that enemies defeated on the Veldt do not give the party any EXP points. They do, however, grant magic ability points and money. So you can do some grinding for spells for a character, or for some extra cash, without a risk of over-leveling or missing out on specific stat boosts. Returning to the overworld, the way it is explored is what really helps to provide the sense of a more complete world. Previous games have occasionally bordered on a feeling of making excuses to force you to travel to every location. 6 combats this in the early game especially, by splitting the party and providing 3 scenarios to play through. This allows exploration of a greater area without a sense of it being busy work. And in the second half of the game, you are likely to explore on your own initiative, just to find out what happened to the earlier locations. Like previous games that feature multiple overworlds, the same is true here. Though taking a leaf from 5, the additional overworld is not completely new. Where 5 took 2 overworlds and merged them together for the final part of the game, 6 takes the overworld, known as the World of Balance, and through a major plot event, ruins it. It is literally known as the World of Ruin. This is where we get to perhaps the greatest strength of the world design, the way it reinforces the narrative. Where the World of Balance is covered in grasslands and forests with bright, bustling towns, the World of Ruin is desolate and depressing, the vibrant greens replaced with muddy browns. Many towns are muted, not just in colour palette, but also the attitudes of the residents. Others have been so thoroughly destroyed that they border on lifeless. These changing towns were effective in Final Fantasy II, and remain so here. Seeing the towns change makes the world more real, gives it a sense of time actually flowing, while also giving the player a greater drive to defeat the villain. This is partly because the towns in the world of Balance have clear identities that are generally integrated into at least one major story event or side quest. These identities are helped by the slight change in overall setting. While previous games were all very much medieval settings, Final Fantasy VI has more of an emerging technological feel to it, bordering on industrial at the heart of the Gestalian Empire. Towns are also assisted in the fact that few, if any, feel like simple pit stops for healing the party and replenishing supplies. On the subject of services, the majority we have seen before. Weapon and armour shops, inns and pubs, mildly censored to cafes in some translations, are all here, though there is a bit more variation in layout. Given the magic overhaul, those shops are gone, but relics have their own stores instead. There is one final service that appears in a few towns. Chocobo stables. The big birds are back. There's one of just 2 transport options available. They offer the same advantages as in previous games, faster movement with no encounters. I will say though that the method of control is not as great. Instead of the regular top-down with directional controls, Chocobos are instead controlled almost like a driving game, where you must point them in a certain direction and hold a button to go. It provides a bit more spectacle, but from a control perspective it doesn't work for me. Which is strange, because the second transport option uses the same control scheme, and it feels great to control. This may be because obstacles that can cause issues with the Chocobo are passed over. Airships are back again, with the usual selection of landing restrictions. There are some finer controls to help you hit the right spot too. They also take inspiration from 3 and 4, with both airships having explorable interiors. In fact, they act as a hub area for changing party members, handy when you might want to swap characters for certain situations. Many of those situations are of course dungeons. The dungeons take all the best bits of those in Final Fantasy V, such as puzzle elements, and throws a couple of new features into the mix. Timed sequences are more prevalent and give a real sense of urgency, especially when the counter keeps on going even during battles. The biggest new dungeon feature is multi-party dungeons. Before you enter, you'll be asked to create 2 or 3 parties out of your selection of player characters, and you must switch between them as you advance through the dungeon, so that one party can unblock a route for another. These are a great addition, keeping other party members relevant even if you have a main quartet. It may feel slightly problematic if you have to use weak characters, but you can usually exit these dungeons easily to train them if you feel it necessary, which it generally won't be. Spreading strong characters between the parties is usually enough to get you through most of these dungeons. The multi-party setup is also great from a story perspective. It allows more characters to be present for key moments, rather than having to explain why suddenly everyone is present at the end of a dungeon when half the cast stayed behind. Dungeon design is also better in a way that is difficult to really quantify. Length just feels like it's in the right ballpark. No dungeon felt too long or too short for their specific point in the game. And in a way, many seem to be more realistically designed. Caves are often more naturally laid out, with flow back and forth between floors, instead of descending through individual floors that are all curiously maze-like. Floors themselves even have a sense of verticality, with the occasional bridge providing a path over another area within the same floor. These are small touches, certainly, but something that makes older games' dungeons seem a little manufactured at times. I could ramble on a little more, but as you can see it's difficult to say precisely why the dungeons are better, but they certainly felt better to play through. Add in that they often worked in tandem with the exterior world design and also the narrative elements, and you have a whole package that feels like a real world that engrosses you and makes the story that much more impactful. When it comes to the story, the first thing to note is that for the first time since Final Fantasy II, the story does not revolve around the concept of 4 elemental crystals. And it makes me rather glad. When 4 of the last 5 games have focused on crystals, it starts to get rather samey. It's also surprising how much the story is helped by the fact that the player isn't on a MacGuffin quest. Looking back at 4, it is a problem that wasn't apparent without the comparison to 6. Knowing that there were still more crystals did make certain aspects a little predictable. Don't get me wrong, the story of 4 is still good, but spoilers for this video, 6's is better. With so much of the story character driven, and no set amount of things to go and find, the story can be more surprising and more creative. More personal and less like a box ticking exercise. To go back to the comparison with Final Fantasy II, a very bare bones, skeletal in fact, version of the plot is similar. An evil empire is using superior force to conquer the world, and we play as resistance fighters trying to stop them. But that doesn't begin to touch the surface. This is your last spoiler warning before we get into territory that might contain more major spoilers. To start with, there is much more detail in all aspects, but especially in the backstory. To keep it reasonably brief, after the ancient War of the Magi, magic dwindled, fading to little more than legend. But after discovering the entrance to the Esper's world, the Empire kidnapped many Espers and began to experiment upon them. They imbued technology and even people with the power from the Espers, creating the Magitech army that they used to begin their campaign of conquest. Already this is more in-depth than 2's backstory of the Emperor made a deal with Hell and now has a demon army. There's a sense of history that is constantly referenced throughout the game, and this backstory has relevance to many of the characters and plot threads. Anyway, this is where we enter the picture. I won't cover all of the story, partially to reduce spoilers to a minimum, but also because there is a lot of story and that would take hours to cover. Instead, I'll just talk about some of the reasons the story is effective. As I said, the backstory and thus main plot has deep connections to many of our characters. Terra is half Esper and a natural user of true magic, making her important to both sides of the conflict. Edgar is the king of Figaro, one of the last nations that has not been conquered by the Empire. Cyan's entire family is killed by Imperials when they conquer the kingdom of Doma. Celes is a former Imperial, a Magitech knight who, despite rising to the rank of general, became disillusioned by some of the tactics used by other Imperials. By tying characters so closely to the story, and by having more than one tied in such a way, the player has a range of characters to identify with, and is able to become much more invested in the narrative, giving them greater desire to continue, and giving events in the story a much greater impact and emotional weight. And other characters don't feel like they're just filling up gameplay roles either. In fact, most of them have their own individual plot threads and character arcs, such as Locke and his quest to find a treasure that might revive his former love, or Setzer and his friend's airship. These plot threads motivate the characters in their interactions with others. They aren't simple side quests either. While engaged in the quest, the characters in question are given additional depth, often dipping into flashback scenes, and usually provide a defining moment for the character in question. All of these aspects come together to create characters that are well-rounded and as human as they could be given the technology available in 1994. On the subject of moments, the game is filled with small scenes that require certain characters to be in the party at certain times. These are rarely essential, if ever, but are often nice little bonuses that help to flesh out some characters and give more context to their actions and interactions with others. They also add a touch of replayability if you didn't fully explore with all characters. On the NPC front, things are still pretty good. Obviously, most of the people in the world are unimportant for the sake of the plot, but keen-eyed players will notice that many of the same NPCs are present both before and after the breaking of the world. It makes the change so much more significant when you see the effect on residents of a destroyed town. Children that once played in the middle of town now cowering in the shells of buildings. Like many aspects, it adds to the drive to take down those responsible for the destruction. The good news is that the villains are the best yet. The Empire as a nation is much more complex than the straight-up evil of previous games. Some Imperials, such as General Leo, act with honour, believing in the Empire itself, but not stooping to vicious or underhanded means to attain victory. Even random Imperial soldiers are given some moments to show that they are not just unthinking goons. That even though they fight for the Empire, they are not zealots, and may in some cases actually be bordering on slaves to the Empire itself. The leader of the Empire, Emperor Gestal, is more cunning than previous Emperor characters, utilising subterfuge alongside the strength of his army. At one point he uses the actions of a subordinate and subsequent events to convene a peace summit that on a first playthrough seems almost legitimate, only for it to all be a trap. It's much more effective and interesting than an emperor that uses strength alone to achieve their goals, and it keeps you guessing. But in truth, Gestal is not even the main villain. That goes to the subordinate I mentioned, the maniacal jester Kefka. Often proclaimed as the best villain of the series, I'm going to hesitantly disagree just slightly. Don't get me wrong, he's up there and is the best so far, but there are a couple of points that bring him down a little. The good first, he definitely makes you hate him. He's vicious, egotistical, power-hungry, and has no regard for honour or even human life. He's truly evil, in a visceral, human way that is even more unsettling given his occasionally childish mannerisms, and it elevates him so far beyond previous villains that were often just nebulous embodiments of evil. It's the old adage, show, don't tell. The Cloud of Darkness might say it is pure evil, but it never actually commits evil deeds itself. Kefka does, repeatedly, and while taking a sadistic joy in the act. His design is also distinctive, not just visually. You certainly won't be confusing him for anyone else, even in versions without character portraits. But he doesn't even need to be on screen for you to know he's there, with his appearance often heralded by sound, and not just a musical theme like previous villains. Fitting the jester look, Kefka often enters a scene with a gale of laughter that will be instantly recognisable to anyone who has played the game before. It's effective, not just for clearly signalling his presence, but for being unsettling in itself, and doubly so when combined with his actions, reinforcing his maniacal nature. This is where we get to those slight negatives. Kefka is a bit of a one-note villain. It's a perfectly struck note, and does its job really well, but it's still just one note. He lacks nuance. After a couple of encounters, you almost won't be surprised by anything he does. He also has little in the way of motivation. He has some backstory, as one of the first to be infused with power from the Espers, but it's more of a why he is who he is. rather than why he does what he does. Now, this is a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things, and Kefka is still a brilliant villain. You want to fight him and take him down. He is memorable and raises the bar for villains in the series. He also improves other narrative elements of the game by serving as a contrast to the player's characters. In the face of their hope and faith, Kefka is uncaring and nihilistic. These are just some of the themes that Final Fantasy VI explores. Across the main plot and the individual character arcs, the game at the very least touches on love, not just romantic, but parental and even brotherly, as well as responsibility, duty, doubt, identity, loneliness, loss, grief, and so much more. Considering that most of the previous games barely went beyond basics of good versus evil, the darkness versus the light, Final Fantasy VI blows them right out of the water, and with all of the other narrative elements taken into account, would set a bar by which all other games, both in the series and outside it, would be measured against. As the final 2D game in the series, Final Fantasy VI pulls out all the stops in the presentation department. Rather than sticking with the same sprite style of the other 16-bit titles, character sprites in 6 are comparatively larger, giving them not just more detail, but also improving the clarity of the greater range of gestures the characters are able to make. Environments are detailed and clear, helping to differentiate towns and also highlight the differences between the world of balance and the world of ruin. The game also makes use of the SNES's Mode 7 graphics features to give chocobo riding and airship travel a 3D quality. It looks a bit aged now, but at the time was quite an impressive effect and likely to be a treat for the eyes. Ears are well served too, with the music arguably the best we've seen. Technical quality is similar to its fellow SNES games, but the range and use of music is so much greater. The official soundtrack features over 60 full tracks. Each character has their own theme again, but they're used in a much more diverse way and often feature certain motifs that are used throughout the game to highlight certain connections. The tone of the music is also used in conjunction with other aspects to reinforce particular feelings and moments. The world of Ruin especially benefits from the deeper use of music. The overworld theme is much more muted, but the player's first few minutes don't even have any music, which highlights the sense of shock and accentuates the loneliness of the solitary island. Battle interfaces are effectively unchanged from 5, and menu interfaces will feel familiar enough to players of previous games. If I have one complaint about the interfaces, it's that relics are in their own menu. While they do have a wider range of features compared to the regular equipment and previous games' accessories, they are still equipped in the same way, their effects are still static, and different relics may require different equipment. Espers have the complexity and cover enough variable information that they do need their own menu, relics less so. Bugs are also remarkably prevalent. Over 100 have been identified, ranging from graphical glitches to things that have an impact on gameplay. The famous Vanish Doom bug makes any battle trivial, while Realm's ability Sketch is hilariously unstable, and can even result in the entire game crashing. Other instances are simply flags that were not set. Depending on your point of view, the amount of bugs shows either the game was rushed, or that there were so many systems with such complexity that a few bugs are inevitable. Personally, I'm split. Given the amount of care that went into the rest of the game, I'd be hesitant to say the developers were lazy. Like its predecessors, the PlayStation port of Final Fantasy VI is basically the same in audio and visuals. This time, even the translation is only altered in very small ways. When one of the biggest changes that is apparent between versions is the battle transitions, you've got a very close port. Interfaces are also the same, and behind the scenes are just a few bug fixes to make the experience smoother. Final Fantasy VI Advance has the same changes the other Advance range games underwent. Visuals are lightened to compensate for the original GBA screen. Audio is much lower quality, even though once again the tracks were optimised for the console. Some of the cutscenes have received alterations for the Advanced version too, generally just in character position rather than content. This is to accommodate the different screen size of the GBA and keep characters in view during the scenes. There is a new translation that covers most of the script. It is both closer to the original Japanese while also coming across as more natural and making more sense. As I said in the intro, some lines were kept because they had become heavily referenced and effectively were part of the game's identity. More bug fixes were implemented, fixing the sketch bug and also removing the Vanish Doom glitch. The bonus dungeons are a good challenge. The Dragon's Den provides tougher versions of some of the optional bosses, while rewarding the player with extra copies of some powerful items. The Soul Shrine is unlocked after beating the Dragon's Den, and is similar to the Cloister of the Dead from 5, in that it features fights against wave after wave of enemies, that completely resets if you leave. The extra espers are more of the same really. They offer some valuable stat boosts and magic spells, though the player does have to hunt them down to acquire them. The final versions include all of the bonus content and are essentially identical to each other. Supporting much higher resolutions, like Final Fantasy V, the sprites were redesigned, and like that game, the results are a little controversial. The core complaint is that the new sprites no longer match the visuals of the rest of the game, which has mostly undergone a simple upscaling. Though it was done properly this time, avoiding the hideous artifacts on tile edges that were present in 5. Like last time, I can understand not liking the new sprites, especially with 6 actually seeing a Western release. Nostalgia is a powerful thing, and most of the complaints do have a point. The character sprites do have a feeling of separation from the actual world. However, it is very minor, and like 5, once you're a few hours into the game, you'll barely notice, because all of the other features have already got you engrossed. Many interfaces have been changed up for this version. Battle controls have been completely revamped, with a focus on touch-based interfaces, including multiple options that can be used. I would have preferred an option even closer to the original style, especially on the PC version where controllers are more likely. That said, none of the touch-focused interfaces are explicitly bad to use, and after a small adjustment period, you'll barely notice. Ending on a more positive note, relics are now kept within the rest of the equipment menu, making it easier to change a character's entire loadout without flicking between menus. For me, this version was just as good to play as the others. But how good is that? It should come as no surprise that the answer to that question is very. Unless you followed the spoiler warning and are joining us from the introduction. Anyway, Final Fantasy VI is fantastic, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to just about everyone. Story fans are very well served, with by far the best story we've seen, with multiple plot threads following the large cast of characters covering a wide range of themes. There is a narrative depth that drags you in and keeps you playing. Twists are well executed and leave you shocked and thrilled, and the story has many moments of genuine emotion that give the player additional motivation. All in all, the narrative of Final Fantasy VI has a true sense of cohesion and it certainly stands the test of time, being more engaging than many games that are 20 years younger. Gameplay fans aren't left in the cold either. The diverse abilities available to the cast are just the tip of the iceberg. With fine control over stat growth and magic spells, a careful player can build their perfect party, which they can then load up with a wide array of equipment, which isn't just focused on which has the biggest numbers. With pieces of equipment capable of granting additional abilities, you can create dozens of potent combinations. Once you include the various possible stat builds for each party member, you have a near limitless number of potential party setups. And while the gameplay has a large degree of complexity, the game as a whole is still remarkably accessible. You aren't forced to learn the ins and outs of every system just to proceed through the game. In fact, you can ignore most of the mechanics and simply grind a bit more and still beat the story. It means that just about anyone can pick up the game and have a great time. I'd even recommend it to people who have little to no experience with the RPG genre. Now, those players who crave difficulty will be underwhelmed by the vanilla game, but there is a whole community who undertake challenges with various different rule sets that ought to test your skill if that is what you enjoy. Overall, Final Fantasy VI has content that should satisfy almost everyone. It is no surprise that the game is considered a classic and sits at the top of many Final Fantasy ranking lists. So, to conclude, yes, you should play it. But as with all previous games, which version should you play? It's quite the question. The different versions all have different strengths. All of them are good games, and if you only have one of the available platforms, you can just go with that version and you'll have a good time. But if you have every console and still haven't played this game, which version should you play? Obviously, it depends on your own preferences, so let's break it down. The SNES versions, including that on the Classic Mini, are the original vision of the game. That in itself is a valuable reason. With consistent visuals and sound, the game is presented as it was intended. It does, however, suffer from a large number of bugs that include some potential game breakers. Realm's sketch, in particular, is basically unusable, it's that buggy. So if you want to explore every inch of the gameplay, you might want to try a different version. The PS1 version doesn't really change many things. Visuals and audio are mostly the same, as are the gameplay bugs. There is an increase in load times, which might also put some people off. The North American version does come with Final Fantasy V, and the European does have a Final Fantasy X demo. The GBA is probably the best balance between the original style of visuals and gameplay functionality. Many of the worst bugs have been fixed, though there are a few new ones, but they aren't as severe. The sound is the big problem. The developers did their best to optimise the music for the console, but there's only so much anyone could do given the hardware. The final versions are all essentially interchangeable. The visuals are revamped, and there is a slight disconnect between characters and backgrounds that affects some people's enjoyment. Interfaces are also a big departure from the classic style. Functional, especially on touchscreens, but not as great for a controller. On the gameplay front, it seems like most gameplay bugs have been dealt with, and some of the interface tweaks have improved aspects such as Bushido charge times, blitz inputs, and the process for equipping relics. Its downloadable nature also makes it more readily available. In the end, it's your choice, but I still firmly recommend you give the game a go, whichever version you pick. That brings this episode to a close. Final Fantasy VI done, and with it, not just the SNES era, but the 2D era too. Next time, we will look at the first 3D game, and the first to have a truly global release. The game that introduced so many to the series, and instantly hooked them. Tune in when I play... Okay, so just a quick aside. While most episodes have been coming out pretty consistently on the first Sunday of every month, I will be putting the series on pause for 1 month. It's a busy time of year, and at time of writing I'm not even out of the first disc of Final Fantasy VII, so rather than scramble and rush to finish the game and force a review out in just a few weeks, especially when the day job is busy, I'm going to take it easy, play at my own pace, and craft a review that lives up to expectations. Given how many people have such fond memories of the game, it deserves a bit of extra time. So, enjoy the holiday season, and try to drag yourself through January. I'll have things ready and waiting so that on the 7th of February you can join me for Final Fantasy VII, From the Top.